High in the American Southwest, in the high desert of Colorado, there are ghost cities hanging in the void. Nestled into the sheer vertical faces of massive sandstone canyons, they look impossible. These are not caves. They are towering, multi-story stone apartment complexes built hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. For centuries, they lay silent, hidden by the piñon and juniper forests known only to the wind and the ravens. When cowboys first stumbled upon them in the winter of 1888, they thought they had found a palace built by a lost race. But these were not built by kings, and they were not lost. They were built by the Ancestral Puebloans, ordinary farmers who achieved an engineering miracle. Around 1200 AD, an entire civilization suddenly decided to leave the flat, easy land on top of the mesa and move down, over the edge of the cliffs. Why? Why would thousands of people choose to live on a precipice where a single misstep meant death? Was it fear? Was it war? Or was it something far more ingenious? New research suggests that these cliff dwellings were not just fortresses of stone, they were machines. They were giant, passive solar engines calibrated to the angle of the sun, designed to capture heat in the freezing winter and reject it in the blistering summer. This is the story of Cliff Palace, the story of how ancient architects, without metal or written math, built the first green city in America, and why, after building this utopia, they walked away and never looked back. MesaVerde, the green table. Rising 8,000 feet above sea level, this massive plateau dominates the landscape of southwestern Colorado. It is a land of breathtaking beauty, but also of violent extremes. In the summer, the high-altitude sun is a weapon. Temperatures soar over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is dry, sucking the moisture from your skin. The rock itself becomes hot enough to burn. In the winter, the script flips. Arctic winds sweep down from the Rockies. Temperatures plunge well below zero. Snow blankets the mesa, turning the world into a frozen white expanse. For a human being without modern technology, this environment is a lethal gauntlet. You freeze or you burn. Yet, people have lived here for thousands of years. For 6 centuries, the Ancestral Puebloans lived on the flat, forested top of the mesa. They lived in pit houses, semi-subterranean homes dug into the soft earth, and later in above-ground pueblos built of poles and mud. Life was hard, but it was stable. They farmed corn, beans, and squash in the rich red soil of the mesa top. But then, around the year 1190 AD, something changed. A shift occurred in the collective mind of the culture. Across the region, families began to abandon their homes on the flat, safe mesa top. They packed their belongings, their pottery, and their tools, and they moved over the edge. They climbed down the sheer vertical sandstone cliffs into the deep, shadowed alcoves, natural C-shaped caves carved by wind and water over eons. And there, hanging between earth and sky, they began to build. This was not a small undertaking. This was a construction project of monumental scale. Imagine the labor. Without draft animals, without wheels, and without metal tools, they had to quarry thousands of tons of sandstone. Using harder river stones as hammers, they shaped the sandstone blocks, pecking them into uniform rectangles. They mixed tons of mortar from mud, ash, and water they had to carry, jar by jar, from distant springs. They cut massive timbers of Douglas fir and juniper, hauling them from the forests above, lowering them down the cliffs with ropes made of yucca fiber to serve as roof beams. And they did all of this while balancing on ledges hundreds of feet in the air. The result was Cliff Palace. It is the crown jewel of MesaVerde, a sprawling complex of 150 rooms and 23 kivas, housing perhaps 100 to 150 people. It had towers reaching 4 stories high, touching the rock ceiling of the alcove. It had plazas, storage granaries, and painted murals. It was a bustling vertical city. But for decades, archaeologists asked the simple question: why? Why choose such a difficult, dangerous place to live? For a long time, the prevailing theory was defense. The 12th century was a time of social upheaval. Perhaps they were hiding from raiding parties, nomadic enemies, or even rival Puebloan clans. The cliffs are certainly defensible. A few men with rocks could hold off an army from the narrow toeholds of the approach. But defense implies fear. And when you look closely at Cliff Palace, you don't see a bunker built in panic. You see a masterpiece of design. You see a structure that is perfectly attuned to the movement of the heavens. This brings us to the solar theory. The alcoves of MesaVerde are not random. The vast majority of the cliff dwellings, including Cliff Palace, face south or southwest. This orientation is not an accident. It is the key to their survival mechanism. The ancestral Puebloans understood the sun in a way we have forgotten. They knew that in the summer, the sun travels a high arc across the sky. It beats down directly from above. But in the winter, the sun travels a low arc, skimming the southern horizon. The massive, overhanging rock brow of the Cliff Palace alcove acts as a perfect natural awning. In the summer, when the sun is high and blazing, the overhang casts a deep, cool shadow over the entire village. While the mesa top bakes in 100 degrees heat, the interior of the alcove remains in the shade, perhaps 15 to 20 degrees cooler. It was ancient air conditioning. But in the winter, the magic reverses. Because the sun is low in the southern sky, its rays slide under the overhang. The sunlight strikes the buildings directly, illuminating the back of the cave. And here is where the materials matter. Sandstone is a thermal mass. It absorbs heat. All day long, the winter sun strikes the stone walls of the houses and the rock of the cliff itself. The stone drinks up the solar energy, storing it like a battery. Then, as the sun sets and the bitter sub-zero desert night sets in, the stone begins to release that stored heat. The village radiates warmth, creating a microclimate in the alcove that keeps the freezing temperatures at bay. It is passive solar engineering at its finest, utilized 800 years before the term green building existed. They didn't need to burn cords of wood to stay warm. They used the rock and the star.
But life in Cliff Palace was about more than just survival physics. It was a complex, vibrant society. The heart of this society was the kiva. If you look at the ruins, you see circular subterranean pits scattered among the square rooms. These are kivas. To enter a kiva, you climb down a ladder through a hole in the roof, much like the homes of Çatalhöyük. Inside, it was a different world. A fire burned in the center, the smoke ventilated by a specialized shaft. In the floor, a small symbolic hole, called the sipapu, representing the portal through which their ancestors first emerged from the underworld. The kiva was a church, a parliament, and a clubhouse all in one. It was where the men gathered to weave cloth, to make laws, and to perform the rituals that kept the world in balance. While the kivas were the spiritual center, the daily grind happened on the courtyards. This is where the women ground corn. The sound of MesaVerde was the sound of grinding. For hours every day, women knelt over metates, sloped grinding stones, using a hand stone called a mano to pulverize dry corn kernels into flour. It was grueling work. The skeletons of older women found in the region show severe arthritis and deformities in their toes and knees and backs from decades of kneeling and rocking at the grindstone. And they weren't just grinding corn, they were grinding stone into the corn. The sandstone tools slowly disintegrated as they worked, adding grit to the flour. As a result, the teeth of the ancestral Puebloans were often worn down to the gum line by the time they were 30. Life was hard on the body. But the hardest part of life in Cliff Palace was the commute. Remember, the alcove was just for living. The food was still up on the mesa top. Every morning, the farmers had to climb up. They scaled the sheer cliff face using hand and toe holds carved directly into the rock. They hiked to the mesa top, farmed their fields of corn, beans, and squash in the hot sun, and then carried the harvest down the cliffs on their backs. And then there was the water. This is a high desert. There are no rivers on the mesa. Places where rainwater, filtering down through a porous sandstone, hits a layer of hard shale and seeps out horizontally from the cliff face. They carved basins into the rock to catch these drips. During dry spells, women might have to hike miles, carrying heavy clay pots to find a producing spring. Every drop of water represented calories burned and risks taken.
For nearly a century, the system worked. Cliff Palace thrived. It was a hub of the region, a ceremonial center. They made beautiful black-on-white pottery with geometric designs. They traded for turquoise from the south and shells from the Pacific coast. They had built a seemingly perfect adaptation to their harsh world. And then the world turned against them. In the year 1276 AD, the tree rings tell us a terrible story. The Great Drought began. For 23 years, the rain stopped falling. On the mesa top, the corn withered. The springs in the cliffs dried up completely. The solar fortress could protect them from the cold, but it could not protect them from thirst and hunger. The archaeological record shifts from stability to stress. We see fewer deer bones and more rabbit and mouse bones. They were eating anything they could catch. And then the decision was made. Just as their ancestors had decided to move down into the cliffs, their grandchildren decided it was time to move on. Around 1300 AD, barely 100 years after it was built, Cliff Palace was abandoned. This was not a panic. It wasn't a Pompeii-style fleeing. It was an orderly departure. They packed their most valuable items. They sealed the doorways of their granaries with stone slabs, perhaps hoping to return. And they walked away. They walked south, leaving the cliffs of Colorado for the Rio Grande Valley. They did not vanish. They became the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Acoma peoples of today. For 600 years, Cliff Palace stood empty. It waited, a silent, perfect machine, waiting for a sun that would still warm its stones every winter, whether humans were there to feel it or not. Today, Cliff Palace stands as a monument, not just to the past, but to the future. In an era where we struggle with energy costs and climate change, these ancient architects teach us a humbling lesson. They didn't conquer nature with brute force or massive energy consumption. They observed it, they understood it, and they built with it. They turned a cliff face into a solar panel and a cave into a home. It remains one of the most beautiful and intelligent structures ever built by human hands.